Baris swallowed hard. This captain was too damn crafty. Even with the fighters doing spot scans, he still had some time, but he knew his time and the safety of the bridge was coming to an end. A sudden thought came to him, and he began typing furiously. He waited until one of the remaining pirates walked into camera view and took a screenshot of the scorpion on the back of his helmet. He dragged the screenshot over to the waiting search bar and ran it. The Federation database held a wealth of knowledge regarding all manner of places and people. Baris hoped that these pirates would be famous enough to make it onto the database. The screen suddenly blinked when it found a match, and Baris opened the file and began to scan through it. These were the Dogs of Andromeda, a group of Federation deserters that had all served on the same ship. They deserted a few years ago after their ship, an S-3 Ajax-class cruiser named Damocles, broke apart while orbiting Andromeda 4. They were under heavy fire from rebels in that system, and the Damocles couldn't handle the pressure. Thus, the dogs were formed. Baris wrinkled his nose. That's why they navigated the ship so easily. They'd served on a similar craft. Baris maneuvered himself back over to the surveillance cameras following the deserters. The group of 3 was now moving into one of the repair bays, which led down into a hangar. The camera feed switched to a wider, zoomed-out angle, giving Baris a better view of the whole bay. The room was massive, stretching on for what felt like forever. An array of huge machines used for lifting, welding, and other mechanical jobs floated about slowly in the dance of zero gravity. There were many bodies here as well, hanging limply. The deserters moved above and under them with ease, their old Federation training serving them well in the weightless environment. Baris watched them and had a thought. This bay was so large that it required several artificial gravity fields to be layered on top of one another in order to cover the entire expanse. You could walk from one end of the bay to the other and step in and out of seemingly borderless fields of gravity. This also allowed repair crews and engineers access to the underside of ships and mechs without the use of bulky lifts and without endangering any lives. Currently, all of the repair bay's generators were operational, but powered down. Baris activated the generators, then began to type. He had to override the gravity safety net, a set of precautions in place to ensure that gravity could never be suddenly switched back on. He needed that sudden switch to catch the deserters off guard. Baris glanced back to the camera feed as he finished typing. The captain and Malchus were now many floors below the bridge. One at a time, Baris told himself, and he focused back on the trio now scattered throughout the repair bay. He watched them diving above and under the wreckage of fighters and service craft with the help of small bursts from their flight suit thrusters. Now was the time to act. Baris flew into action above the keyboard. He watched as a chunk of the repair bay was suddenly thrown into gravity. All the floating wreckage, parts, and bodies crashed to the floor. A burst of red splashed across the floor as one of the deserters was crushed beneath a mech. The 2 remaining deserters shouted in shock, and one yelled into his comm. "Cage has just been killed. The gravity is being returned to the repair bay." The machinery fell heavily to the floor, and another deserter lay dead, impaled by a long, sharp piece of duroplating. The surviving deserter jetted himself towards the door as Baris turned on field after field. The symphony of clashing and crunching metal played through the deserter's radio, and Baris watched him narrowly miss death time after time. Suddenly, his flight suit's thrusters sputtered just as Baris turned on a field right behind him. The deserter stumbled in midair, caught in the limbo. A small energy cell exploded as a repair mech crashed into the floor, and a shower of metal and heavy plastic flew up from the explosion. The deserter was peppered with shards of metal and hung limp in the air. The deserters were silent for a moment. Then the captain's voice rasped out over the comm. "Hollis, take the Devastator up to the bridge and see if there are any survivors there. I want a detailed scan."
"Roger that,"
came the pilot's reply. Damn, he had only seconds before the fighter would arrive and see him, so he opened up several subsystems and began typing quickly. Baris brought online a small ballistic cannon on the top floor of the main deck. It was the closest weapon system to the bridge. After the cannon was brought online, he initiated a scan or overhaul that cloaked the gun's functionality. With that complete, he grabbed the wiring kit, welder, and door extender and pushed himself into the lift. Just as he was descending into the shaft, he saw the tip of the fighter come into view outside the viewport and the bright light shine in. Baris turned himself around and used the ladder to pull himself through the weightless shaft. Without the deserters' radio to listen in on, Baris knew he was isolated and vulnerable. He continued to pull himself deeper and deeper into the shaft, past internal controls to the floors below, where the bridge tower lift connected to the main part of the ship. The bridge of the Cyclops appeared from the outside to sit atop the mighty ship, but it was only accessible through this one lift. Baris sailed past a pair of inner blast doors a couple floors below the internal controls, and he could barely read life support in faded and scorched yellow paint. No doubt there was a breach in the hull here. Life support was hit hard in the attack. Baris knew that much. Finally, he came to the last floor, which led out to the rest of the ship. The only problem was that the lift had crashed itself into the floor of the shaft, and its wreckage was now partially blocking the only doors out into the main ship. Baris lowered himself onto the broken sheets and beams of metal and began to cut a hole for himself with the xenofuel welder. He flipped on the torch to its cutting temperature and got to work. After 20 minutes of cutting, Baris was through. The vastness of the ship was revealed to him once more as he stepped out through the hole in the thick metal lift doors. On either side, the ship seemed to stretch away like a labyrinth. It was dark, and only the auxiliary lights were on. A few bodies floated amongst the loose wiring and wreckage. He stopped for a moment and gathered his thoughts. It felt like years since he had left his quarters and traveled these halls. Shaking his head hard in the zero-G, Baris steadied himself, then pushed himself down the hall. Using the door frames to steady and steer himself forward, Baris maneuvered towards the starboard cannon battery. It sat at the end of a hall that connected with the staircase to the lower levels. After a few moments of pushing himself and sailing through the dim and dusty hall, Baris saw the door marked SS Light Cannons, authorized personnel only. Suddenly, a light flashed through into the hall from the stairs, and in floated the two remaining deserters. Baris caught himself on the door frame and pulled himself to hiding. He peered past the frame and watched them, only some 30 feet away. He watched as the captain and Malchus guided themselves into the hall and stopped. Malchus turned to the captain. "What's next, Captain?" he asked, his voice nasal and slight.
"You heard Hollis. He couldn't find anything on the bridge," he growled. "So we're going to go check it out ourselves."
With that, the two began maneuvering themselves through the floating debris. Baris was gripped with panic. They were headed right for him. He did the first thing that came to his mind and went entirely limp. He closed his eyes and did his best to seem dead. He heard the deserters' thruster bursts get louder as they jetted past him, and then quieter as they made their way further down the hall. Baris opened his eyes a crack and made sure they were well beyond sight and sound before pushing himself off a nearby wall. He drifted towards the cannon door and caught himself lightly on it. When the Cyclops was fully functioning, a special double-encrypted passcode was needed to access the cannon room, but that was no longer necessary, as the computer lock was no longer functional. A blinking exclamation point shone across the blue-green screen, so Baris prepared the door extender, hoping that he had given it enough time to recharge. The mechanical whirring of the extender seemed deafening in the utter stillness of the ship, and Baris kept glancing down the hall to the last place he had seen the deserters. The weight had done it good. When the extender stopped working, Baris saw that it had pushed the heavy doors almost all the way open. He moved himself through the opening into the cannon room. It was cast in the orange glow of the auxiliary lights, and sparks jumped about the room every few seconds. Looks like this place got hit hard, Baris thought. There were steps from the door that led down into the moderately large room. Long computer tables were in rows, with an aisle between them that led into the targeting station on the opposite wall. Of the two viewports on that wall, one was cracked and the other was broken and covered with a blast shield. Oddly enough, the gravity generators were functioning here, and Baris dropped to his feet when he passed the threshold. He stood for a moment and surveyed the destruction. It was some 50 years previous, after a small uprising in several neighboring systems, that the Federation had implemented automated cannon repair and reload into all of their ships. Small drones and repair mechs were sent to the cannon stations instead of people. The rebels had often targeted turrets and guns during engagements, which often led to deaths among reloading and maintenance crews. So expendable machines took their place, and the cannon stations were all but closed off from the rest of the ship. The targeting systems were still man-operated, but the men and women firing the guns were actually relatively far from the guns themselves. This made firing the guns accurately rather difficult, which in turn made the role of the gunner more important than before. Baris had only fired the light 50mm guns in training simulators during his time at the Federation Academy, and even though he aced the exercise, he wasn't too confident about firing them live. Baris walked slowly through the aisle, looking at the cracked computer screens and empty stations. He wondered how many people had been at their posts when the viewports cracked. The eerie feeling made his skin crawl. Isolation was beginning to creep into his mind, and it was becoming harder to focus on the task at hand. Guns, he thought dully, and moved towards the opposite wall. There were several large screens in front of a chair and controls, and Baris slid into the chair. Immediately sensing his weight, the screens lit up, each showing a view from a different camera on the guns, which were a story above him on the outside of the ship. He could see the nose of the Umbra transport and the other Predator floating alongside it. He reached out and grabbed the controls, then watched as the turret moved up and down and side to side at his command. Baris was thankful he had time to practice. He felt truly out of his element in the gunner's seat, and his life depended on his ability to take down those fighters. He kept his eye on the stationary ships, but suddenly the other Predator drifted into the turret's vision. He must be rejoining the others, Baris thought, and his mind raced. The Predator was well within range, but if he waited much longer, who knows where it would go? He shook his head and pulled the trigger. The cannons responded immediately, unleashing a terrible fury of explosive shells. He was a bit behind the Predator, so he compensated his aim, sending a hail of shells that ripped through the enemy ship. A bright orange and yellow explosion blossomed in the camera and quickly dissipated. The ship was blasted apart into thousands of steel and heavy plastic bits. Without taking his finger off the trigger, he moved his aim to the remaining Predator, but this one would not go down so easily. Seeing its fellow destroyed, the Predator banked hard to its starboard side, gliding out in front of Baris and the cannons. As it moved, it unleashed a barrage of dumbfire missiles upon the Cyclops. The ship shuddered as the explosions cut into its thick hull. Baris quickly adjusted his aim again, but as he did, the Predator began rising up and falling back down in an attempt to evade. With its payload of missiles delivered, the enemy fighter fired its rotary cannons and unloaded upon the Cyclops. Thousands of heated xenorite rounds sank into the Cyclops in seconds. Baris struggled to catch the Predator in his sights as the enemy's fire grazed across the already cracked viewport. The Predator then sank to avoid Baris's fire, but he whipped the controls down and sent the 50mm sweeping across its cockpit. Another shell punched through its body and hit the engines, and the ship bloomed into a brilliant fireball. Baris could see the Umbra transport slowly flying away, so he kept his finger on the trigger and dragged it across the open space until he found it in his sights. Several small explosions rocked the transport, and then it drifted slowly away. Baris breathed a sigh of relief, but gasped slightly when he heard 2 pairs of boots hit the deck behind him. He turned quickly in his seat and ducked behind it as a blast of plasma hit the targeting computer. The screens exploded from the focused heat and radiation. Baris peeked out from behind the chair and saw the captain of the Dogs of Andromeda recharging his beam rifle, while Malchus advanced on him with a long combat knife. Baris quickly drew his welder and flipped it on. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it would do the job if need be. Another blast from the beam rifle came in, this time striking the chair. Baris could feel the heat of the plasma melting the back of the chair. Beam weapons were in their battlefield youth, and still hadn't yet surpassed ballistic weapons in killing power or usefulness. Baris listened as the footsteps drew nearer and peeked out again. Malchus was at the last row of computer tables and almost at the foot of the stairs. Baris winced as another shot from the captain collided with the chair. He could smell the melting metal. He glanced out again at Malchus and saw he was only 10 or so feet from the chair. Now or never, he thought, and he jumped out from the chair and charged Malchus. If the deserter was surprised, he hid it well. He stood his ground and gripped his knife firmly. Federation close-quarters combat training was minimal but effective, and Baris thought back to it as he drew near to Malchus. As he came up close, Malchus swung up with his knife, cutting into Baris's open hand. Baris led with his non-dominant hand to protect himself, and it worked. It was a deep cut, and it hurt a lot, but the pain didn't cloud Baris's mind. He swung the welder across Malchus's face, leaving a searing gash. Automatically, Malchus brought his hand up to grab at his face, while a scream of agony issued from his lips. His hand batted away the welder, but Baris, acting on instinct, dropped to his knees, drew Malchus's pistol from his belt, and fired 2 10mm rounds into his chest. As Malchus fell, another plasma blast narrowly missed Baris, who dove forward behind the front row of computer tables. His hand was now bleeding profusely, and he gripped the pistol hard. He steadied his breathing and jumped up and turned towards the captain. The pistol shook in his hands as he fired round after round up the steps, and the muzzle flash dazed him. He stopped firing when he realized that the captain wasn't there. Shaking slightly, he lowered the gun. The captain suddenly jumped up again, a row closer, and raised his rifle. A shot rang out in the targeting room, and the captain fell dead. Baris didn't even believe he had pulled the trigger until he saw the smoking pistol in his own raised hand. A foul taste appeared at the back of his throat, and he grimaced. All this killing, he thought darkly, then shook his head. Baris slowly made his way back to the bridge after wrapping his hand in a strip of cloth from his undershirt. By the time he had made it there, the wound had stopped bleeding. I'll still have some nanobots left in my system, he thought, as he glided over to the central computer. Baris navigated to the engine system analysis. Now that the immediate threat of the dogs of Andromeda was taken care of, his first priority was getting the Cyclops moving. Baris initiated a few diagnostics and waited as the computer gathered the necessary information. His hand still shook from the intense power of the pistol. He shook his head and focused his thoughts on the computer, not on the lives he had taken. A second later, the diagnostic program finished, but when Baris read through the report, his heart fell. The quad Prometheans were all battered beyond use, and one of them beyond repair. The Vestorans got us bad, he thought. Then another thought came to him, and he navigated back to the surveillance feeds. I need to alert the Federation that we've been disabled, he thought, and then he found what he was looking for. If I can't bring the Cyclops to the Federation, he said softly to himself, I'll bring the Federation to the Cyclops. He pushed himself back towards the lift, taking the tools with him. Though the journey would take some time, he was on his way to the nearest docking bay. The Cyclops could carry many ships of various sizes, from fighters to minor freighters, but Baris needed only one ship to get him to the nearest Federation outpost. The Vale-class transport had caught his eye on the surveillance feed, and he knew from the footage that it would still be operational. It had the hyperlight engine he needed for faster-than-light travel. He knew where the docking bay was, and hopefully the path to it was uncompromised. Very slowly, or so it seemed to him, he glided through the deserted and broken Cyclops until he finally reached his destination. The door opened at his command, thanks to the functioning internal controls, and Baris floated past the threshold. The small craft of the Cyclops floated about the massive docking bay. The magnetic seals that held them to the bay floor deactivated during the loss of power, allowing the multi-ton ships to drift freely. Baris spotted the Vale floating behind a repair mech and pushed off towards it. He navigated around the mech and the bow of a small fighter and opened the hatch of the Vale. It was spacious inside, capable of accommodating a 2-man crew and 10 passengers. Baris pulled himself up a small flight of stairs into the cockpit, which sat at the top of the bow. This gave him an almost 270-degree view around the ship. He punched in the override startup code, and the Vale came to life. Immediately he activated the Vale's artificial gravity. Baris was beginning to feel sick from the zero-G, and he was trained extensively on the adverse effects of a weightless environment. He fired up the Vale's spot thrusters and maneuvered the ship through the jungle of floating ships toward a dock. After scraping its hull a few times on bits of wreckage, the Vale finally landed on a loading dock. Baris activated the magnetic seal, then rose from his seat to quickly don a flight suit that was stashed away in a nearby compartment. After latching his helmet onto the flight suit, he opened the hatch and pushed out towards the loading dock manual control panel. Usually attendants behind the glass ran through a checklist that lasted an hour, but Baris would have to do it all himself this time. He punched in a few commands, then pushed himself back towards the ship. There was a great grinding sound as he flew out to it, and the Vale began to sink into the floor. The loading dock lowered a craft down onto a decompression chamber, which, once completed, would then release the ship out into space. Baris almost missed the Vale as it sank, but grabbed the door of the hatch and pulled himself inside. After quickly removing his helmet, he sealed the door and made for the pilot's seat. The Vale sank lower and lower, slowly making its way to the very bottom of the Cyclops. All around the Vale was the dark metal walls, with flashing white lights every few meters. Finally, the lift stopped, and the Vale sat facing the bare metal walls until the floor opened up below her and she drifted freely. Baris used small bursts from the spot thrusters to lower the Vale out of the shaft. Suddenly, the light from the distant Omega Lear was revealed, and Baris could see the true wreckage of the Cyclops. Pulling his gaze away, he fired up the engines and rocketed away from the battered cruiser. He achieved the needed distance after a few seconds. Baris initiated the hyperlight drive and the ship began to hum. As the light of the FTL engines began to glow around the veil, Baris glanced back at the Cyclops. "Don't worry," he said softly. "I'll be back."